Hello, everyone, and welcome to the English Hour. In today's episode, we'll talk about formal versus informal education. And I think this has become a more important debate, especially in the recent years, because in the past, people usually had access to formal types of education, but with the advent of the internet and with the spread of the smartphones and tablets and everything, I think people can really access various kinds of education online on their devices. And there is, I don't think, as much need as to go to school as people used to have in the past. So what do you think about this, Canberk?
Well, I think this debate will always be relevant in one form or another. But due to the reasons that you mentioned, I think it's becoming more relevant at this point in time. Formal education is such a large part of our lives. I mean, if we think of our lives as time and space, just as we can think of everything as time and space, this is a little reductive, but at the same time, it's helpful. If we think of our lives as time we spend, formal education takes so much time. It's decades. So if you think about it that way, I think it is testament to how important it is.
Well, I think it would be useful and beneficial for our listeners to look at the both sides of this debate. So maybe we can simply first outline the benefits and disadvantages of both the formal and informal education, and then delve deeper. So first, I can talk about the advantages and disadvantages of formal education, and then you can talk about the advantages and disadvantages of informal education. So I'll start with formal education. Is that okay?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so I think the greatest advantage of formal education is being able to form relationships with real people, because by its very definition, in formal schooling or informal education settings, you meet with other people. You meet your teachers, your peers, your colleagues, you carry out team projects and so on. So there is the intimate touch that comes with formal education and the memories, the real life memories that come with it. But I don't think that it's superior to informal education with regards to the content. When it comes to disadvantages, I think an advantage can also be a real disadvantage. For example, it's great to be in the same classroom with people that you like and that you cooperate, but in some cases, maybe you are a part of a group or a class that does not really align with your values or your understanding, and in those cases, it can be a real pain in the neck. So another disadvantage would be the commute that generally formal education settings require. So if you live far from your school or institution, you have to spend hours in traffic. So I think these are the most common disadvantages that come to my mind. But I think you can also say that in the formal education settings, you don't have a lot of say over the curriculum. So you're basically given a curriculum and you have to follow it regardless of its benefits. So these are the things that come to my mind. So what do you think about the advantages and disadvantages of informal education?
Well, the benefits and difficulties or disadvantages of formal and informal types of education actually dovetail quite nicely, meaning the advantages of one could be the disadvantages of the other. In the case of informal education, for example, just as you mentioned, intimate touch and having access to people, spending time with people is an advantage. In the case of informal education, this becomes a disadvantage because you are isolated from community and also from the society at large, depending on how you choose to carry out your educational activities. But in most forms, informal education is, in a way, a little difficult to do with people. So it's kind of isolation is a problem. Another disadvantage could be related to careers, for example. education and careers go hand in hand, especially in higher levels of education. So you encounter many different opportunities through people and by being able to make your accomplishments public, because in formal education, this is much easier. There's an organized system and your performance is being measured at different levels by many people, and it is made public, so you can get treatment according to your performance levels. So in terms of career opportunities, this could present problems for people who choose the route of informal education. However, there are immense advantages and benefits. And I think the foremost benefit is freedom. Freedom to approach education however you want. And of course, this also brings another disadvantage or con, because this is incredibly difficult to do right. So it is a lot of responsibility. You have to have good judgment to be able to do that. And at the same time, informal education gives you flexibility in how you approach your training and education, because if you do it online, most of the time you're going to do it online in this day and age. And you can use books and other resources, but online is the way to go most of the time. And if you do it that way, then you have access to videos and documents and all kinds of materials and content 24/7. So it doesn't matter when you want to study and where you want to study, as long as you have access to a laptop and maybe your headphones and the internet, you're good to go. So this is a huge advantage. But at the same time, if you lack the necessary time management skills to accommodate your classes and to accomplish your goals, then you're going to be left behind, which formal education actually does a good job of preventing. And I can also talk about ease of access. That's also important from the perspective of informal education. As I said, laptop and internet is good enough for you. So that's basically the pros and cons. And I think, as I said in the beginning, the pros of informal education could be cons of formal education and vice versa. So I think maybe if we go ahead with the discussion of which one's better and how we can benefit from both, we can also talk about these similarities and differences.
Yeah, well, I think they can be viewed as complementary forms of education, but generally people view them as separate or competing approaches. But I think one can also view them as sort of complementary forms of education. So, for example, formal education can really be supported by different forms of informal education, and informal education can be supported by real-life curricula or formal education. So, for example, let's talk about our personal feelings. For example, Canberk, what is the one thing that you really like about formal education?
The one thing I liked about formal education was how systematic it was. I think, especially in the beginning, a lot of learners are unequipped to make decisions with regards to their educational career because they don't have the tools to think strategically and systematically. Systematically meaning think about systems. For example, right now we are doing a podcast. If we keep in mind the reasons for why we're doing it, and the motivation that we have for doing it, we're going to be more successful because we will be able to make the necessary decisions and adjustments on the way if we have to. But if we are unaware of what's going on and we think that we're just chatting, then we're not going to be able to get the most benefit out of it. Especially our listeners will not be able to get the most benefit out of it. Just like this, in formal education, there's a system, right? Organized learning. There are teachers, there are institutions built for this very purpose and nothing else. And there's a progression. There are curricula. There are a lot of things that come together to make this a successful, for the most part, successful system. And actually, the welfare and development of the country and an entire society of millions of people depends on the success of this system. So it has to succeed. And for the most part, it does. So I think system is what I like about formal education, system and standards.
Okay, well, it's definitely a much more detailed answer than I expected. Well, I'll move on to my second question, which is very much related to the first one. So what is the one thing that you really hate about formal education?
Well, every medallion has two coins, and actually the thing that I don't like about formal and that I hate about formal education is how ignorant it can be, or how unsubtle it can be, of differences between individuals. So it is as you said, as you know, there's this term called cookie cutter program.
Yeah.
So it's like everybody going into a school, everybody getting into this system of education. I think everybody at one point feels like they're being basically streamrolled, like they're being pushed through this production line, and they're getting the same exact thing in terms of information and knowledge and experience as everybody else. And there's very little to differentiate between person to person. However, there are two problems with this. One is every individual is unique to a certain degree. I'm saying to a certain degree because we share an incredibly huge common ground. But at the same time, we have unique capabilities and characteristics. And formal education fails to cater to those characteristics. And I think this could be a very, very good point where we can talk about informal education as you said, as a complementary method to fill those gaps. So basically, what I hate about formal education is how indifferent it can be to individual differences.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to note the fact that formal education is structured to maintain the existing system. For example, when students go to educational institutions, the goal is not necessarily to make them the best they can be. The goal is to make them individuals that will function in that given society, that will fill the positions in different companies, in different factories, in different institutions in that society. So this is why formal education sometimes fails to satisfy the current generation of individuals. And I think our generation or newer generations, we're looking for more. We just don't want a single set of instructions by which to operate our lives. We want more from life. We want a purpose, and we really want to make sure that we have the chance to fulfill our potentials. And this is interesting because I think in the formal education system, a lot of us do not really think about the purpose of education and the structure of education. And this was definitely the case for me. And when I was doing my undergrad at Boğaziçi, I think, I'm not sure if you've taken the same class, but I'll refer to one of the classes. I don't remember the name of the class, but in one of the classes, we talked about the history of Turkish education system, and we analyzed different eras and so on. And that made me realize that certain political ideologies definitely try to shape the education system in order to shape the people. And a lot of governments, a lot of states around the world use education as a means of controlling and manipulating their societies. And in that regard, formal education can be really limiting, because if the state or if the government is not really interested in liberating their citizens, making them global citizens, then the education will, of course, not be very universal. And I think in this regard, informal education really comes to help, because you're not bound by the rules of your government, you're not bound by the rules of anyone, and you can simply choose to learn anything at any time. And that's, I think, the beauty of it. But as you mentioned, if you lack the self-discipline, if you lack the necessary time management skills and the willpower, then you might feel very disoriented, and you might not really make progress. You might jump from one subject to another without making a lot of progress, and that might be the really I think to me that's the most pressing downside, because a lot of people suffer from a lack of attention and a lack of focus, and if you give them an informal education curricula to follow, I think most of them would have a really difficult time in. So what do you think about this?
Well, you brought up a few great points. I think the point about people being spoon-fed certain types of information and maybe prevented from reaching other types of information in terms of the government's efforts to manipulate its society. I think this was a great point, because formal education could be the best, bar none, system that they can use to do this. Like, if you can use the same strategies of manipulation and control by using other organs and apparatuses. For example, the media is a great one, but it addresses adults, is actually more about adults with children and responsibilities. And people in their adulthood are not really malleable in terms of how they view the world. They have set opinions, they are set in their ways, as they say, and they're not going to change that much. But young people are much more impressionable. And in that regard, I think formal education could be a great tool for a government to do that. And unfortunately, human beings will suffer the consequences. On the other hand, I agree with the point, as I just also mentioned, that it's really hard to expect young children and young adults to make their own decisions in terms of how they best can educate themselves. It's really hard. And even in the case of individuals who are self-disciplined, who are motivated, who have the necessary time management skills and organizational skills, even in the case of those individuals, if they are too young, then even they will not be able to make the right decisions, and unfortunately will lose a lot of time and energy in trying to decide which is best for them. So I think up to a certain point, it's really important to get a formal education. And of course, it comes with all of its downsides and drawbacks, but people in power, if they want the good of this country and the society in mind, if they have it in mind, then I think they're going to make the necessary adjustments over the long term to maybe eliminate and maybe shave off some of those negativities.
I definitely agree. And I think there is a solution to the problems presented by informal education. And as we mentioned, one of the problems is lack of orientation and problems that might arise due to lack of willpower and guidance. So I think it's possible to create programs or curricula that include a guidance part. So you might have different forms of guided informal learning. And as a matter of fact, I think I've got a lot of experience with that part, because I've been experimenting with this concept. So giving students freedom, but also giving them guidance at certain intervals. And I think you will remember the case of Ahmet, one of our students, and right now we have two more in the office, and they are subject to an informal curricula. So they go through the classes on their own and at their own pace. No one is forcing them to go very fast or very slow. So they're learning on their own, but there is intervention and guidance at certain intervals, maybe once a day or twice a day or maybe every 2 days. We have intervals and guidance. And I think this is a method or system that can be generalized to larger populations. For example, if you're leading a language class, if you're leading a history class, if you're leading a politics class, then you can assign readings to students, but then you might have in-person meetings maybe twice a week. And I think that would cure the problems at least partially cure the problems that are brought forward by informal education. Because you might introduce a certain dose of regularity or a certain dose of systematicity to your program, and I think that might really address some of those problems. What do you think? Because, I mean, from personal experience and with my experience with several students, I've seen that if I give them the tools and the resources and the materials, if I empower them to work on their own, if I help them to devise a study plan, and if I let them do it and guide them when they need guidance and help, it really helps. And what's more, it helps them to develop willpower and discipline and time management skills. And I value them a lot more than the teaching I do, because if I can help students to gain those skills, I think they'll achieve far greater success in life than I can imagine.
Well, I think experience is key here, because whenever you want to try something out, you have to give it some time and breathing room so that it can manifest itself. It can show you what it's about. And in the case of this more structured form of informal education, I think experience has shown you, and also with Ahmet to me, that it is a successful method. I think there's still a long way to go in perfecting it in terms of being able to generalize it to people and like maybe open it to masses. But at the same time, I think there are a lot of positive things about it that are ignored by a formal education system. And if you think about formal versus informal, the very reason why this dichotomy became relevant at all is because the systems, the formal systems of education that we have in place right now in all the nation states date back to a time where there was no internet and there was no imagination that could empower an invention like the internet. So there was no options but to have all of the students come together in time and space so that a teacher could teach anything to them. And that was the only option. There was no other option for people to learn and for people to be educated. But today, that's not the case. And actually, giving people more flexibility and more freedom in their learning, while at the same time holding them accountable for how much they learn and actually also at what speed they learn, what pace they learn, could be a great way for even larger organizations like the Minister of Education of a nation state, for example, so large, to rethink some of the strategies that they have in place in terms of making education and learning as effective as possible. So I see a lot of potential in this method being used at a larger scale, but as I said, experience will guide the way.
Sure. Well, I think this has been a very deep conversation about different aspects of education, and especially with regards to the formal and the informal side. And I think it's time to sort of wrap things up and give our concluding remarks. I'll go first, and I think informal education will, in time, become the dominant form of education, because there is an ever-increasing need for learning, and the formal education system is not able to really keep up with that demand. And in many cases, the formal education, once the students complete their formal education, what they learn becomes obsolete. So they have to find ways to keep themselves updated all the time. So this really necessitates the transfer, the move to the informal education, and I think that will cause it to be the dominant form of education in the future. But as I said, I believe a certain dose of guidance, a certain level of guidance will be required to have the maximum or the optimal results. And as a result, I think guided education or guided informal education will be a thing of the future. So what do you think? What are your final remarks, Canberk?
Well, I'm thinking about this situation and about these two concepts along similar lines. I think we are at a point right now where the speed at which the world is changing and information is being updated is faster than formal educational institutions and systems can catch up with. So I think this reality has to be driven home to decision makers, and they have to really understand that they are putting people through an extremely inefficient system of education, and they are hurting their economies and their R&D departments and their science and technology efforts of all kind. And I think once they understand that they're hurting themselves, I think they're going to introduce drastic changes in the way people are educated. And I think the key concept is going to continue to be accountability. And I think the transition from a formal education to an informal education, a more structured form of informal education, would be great in improving our understanding of the concept of accountability. Because even though there's accountability in formal education, it's not in a way that is going to allow individuals to develop self-respect. I think that's really important. We keep our students accountable at schools, in classrooms. We do that. Our teachers do that. But the way they do it is a little repressive. Repressive in the sense that they have to do it or they're going to fail their classes. They're not going to be able to proceed with the next year's classes and courses, and they're going to fall back on their education. So there's a lot of negative stimulus for students to succeed. However, I think a healthier form of accountability would be to help people understand that whatever they do in life, they're going to have to do it for themselves and for their values. And if they want to do it, great. If they don't, then there are going to be consequences. Once they understand those things, they don't have to be supervised all the time. And I think they would be more autonomous individuals, and that would help the society.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I guess in summary, students will have to eventually take charge of their learning, and I guess that's my final say. Well, everyone, thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.